The morning sun had barely risen over the palace grounds when Edward Harrison adjusted his ceremonial hat and took his position outside the Queen's private quarters. He had served as a royal guard for 12 years, and in all that time nothing unusual had ever happened during his watch. The palace operated like a well-oiled machine, with everyone knowing their place and following the rules without question. Edward was proud of his position. His father had been a guard before him, and his grandfather too. The Harrison family had protected the royal family for 3 generations. Every morning he would stand at attention, his eyes scanning the corridors, his mind alert for anything out of the ordinary. Today felt different, though. There was an odd tension in the air that he couldn't quite explain. The Queen had left for an official state visit to France 2 days ago. The palace felt quieter without her presence, almost hollow. The staff moved about their duties with less urgency, and the usual stream of visitors had slowed to a trickle. Edward found these quiet periods almost more stressful than the busy ones. When things were too calm, his mind would wander, and he would imagine problems that didn't exist. Around mid-morning, he heard footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. Edward straightened his posture and kept his eyes forward as protocol demanded. The footsteps grew closer, and he recognized the distinctive click of expensive heels against the polished floor. Lady Camilla Worthington appeared around the corner, her elegant navy dress swishing as she walked. She was a member of the Queen's inner circle, someone who had been granted special access to areas of the palace that most people would never see. Camilla had been a fixture at the palace for about 5 years. She had started as a cultural advisor, helping the Queen with matters related to art and history. Over time, her role had expanded, and she had become something of a confidant to Her Majesty. The other staff members seemed to like her well enough, though Edward had always kept his distance. It wasn't his place to befriend the nobility. His job was to observe and protect. "Good morning, Edward," Camilla said with a warm smile as she approached. She always remembered the guards' names, which was more than could be said for most of the aristocrats who passed through these halls. "Good morning, Lady Worthington," Edward replied, keeping his tone professional but courteous. "I need to retrieve some documents from the Queen's study," she explained, pulling a small key from her purse. She asked me to review them before her return. Edward nodded. This wasn't unusual. Camilla had been given keys to certain rooms and often ran errands for the Queen. He had seen her enter the private study dozens of times before. There was no reason to question it. She unlocked the door and disappeared inside, leaving Edward alone in the corridor once more. 20 minutes passed. Edward remained at his post, his mind drifting to his daughter's upcoming birthday. She would be turning 7 next week, and his wife had been planning a party for months. He made a mental note to stop by the toy shop on his way home to pick up the doll she had been asking for. The sound of the study door opening pulled him back to attention. Camilla emerged, looking slightly flustered. Her usually perfect hair had a strand out of place, and there was a faint pink flush on her cheeks. She was carrying a leather folder, presumably the documents she had mentioned, but something else caught Edward's eye. The collar of her dress had shifted, and beneath it he could see the glint of something gold. At first he thought it might be a necklace she was wearing, but as she adjusted her purse, the object shifted, and he realized it wasn't sitting against her skin, the way jewelry normally would. It appeared to be tucked inside her dress, concealed from view. Edward felt a cold knot form in his stomach. His training kicked in, and he began to observe more carefully without making his scrutiny obvious. Camilla's movements were hurried, not her usual graceful pace. Her eyes darted left and right as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Her hand kept moving to her chest as though making sure something was still in place. "Is everything all right, Lady Worthington?" Edward asked, his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Yes, of course," she replied quickly. Perhaps too quickly. "Just running a bit late for a meeting." "Have a good day, Edward." She walked away briskly, her heels clicking faster than before. Edward watched her go, his mind racing. Should he follow her? Should he report what he had seen? But what had he really seen? A glimpse of gold that might have been anything. He couldn't accuse a member of the Queen's trusted circle based on such flimsy evidence, yet something was wrong. Every instinct he had developed over 12 years of service was screaming at him. The way she had acted, the flush in her cheeks, the nervous adjusting of her dress, it all added up to someone who was hiding something, and that glimpse of gold kept flashing in his mind. Edward knew the Queen kept some of her personal jewelry in the study. Not the crown jewels or anything of massive historical significance, but pieces that had sentimental value. There was a small locked drawer in the desk where she kept items she wanted close but secure. Had Camilla taken something from that drawer? The morning stretched on, and Edward couldn't shake his unease. When his replacement arrived for the shift change, he found himself walking not toward the exit but toward the security office.
He needed to speak with Captain Morrison, the head of Palace Security.
This was above his pay grade, and he needed guidance on what to do next. Captain Morrison was a stern man in his 60s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Edward had always respected him, even feared him a little. He knocked on the office door and waited for the gruff "enter" before stepping inside. "Harrison," Morrison said, looking up from his paperwork. "What brings you here?" Edward took a breath and explained what he had witnessed. As he spoke, he watched Morrison's expression shift from mild interest to serious concern. When Edward finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "That's quite an accusation," Morrison said slowly. "Lady Worthington has been nothing but trustworthy for years." "I know, sir," Edward replied. "But something wasn't right. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw." Morrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your family has served this palace with honor for generations, Harrison. If you say something was wrong, I believe you. But we need to be careful. We can't simply accuse someone of her standing without proof." "What should we do?" Edward asked. Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens. "First, we need to check the Queen's study. Discreetly. If something is missing, then we have grounds to investigate further. If nothing is missing, then perhaps Lady Worthington simply had a stressful morning, and we can all breathe easier." Edward nodded, feeling both relieved that he was being taken seriously and anxious about what they might discover. Morrison called for the master key, and the two of them made their way back to the Queen's private quarters. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary, but Edward couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something that would shatter that peace completely. Captain Morrison unlocked the heavy oak door to the Queen's study with practiced efficiency. The room smelled of old books and lavender, a scent the Queen particularly favored. Edward had only been inside this room a handful of times in his 12 years of service, always during routine security sweeps. It felt strange to enter now, knowing the Queen was hundreds of miles away. The study was exactly as one might expect a monarch's private workspace to be. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined two walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on history, politics, and art. A large mahogany desk sat near the window, its surface neat and organized. Several photographs in silver frames showed the royal family at various events and celebrations. Everything appeared untouched, perfectly in place. Morrison walked slowly around the room, his experienced eyes scanning every surface. Edward followed, feeling like an intruder despite having every right to be there. The captain moved toward the desk and tried the small drawer on the right side. It was locked as expected. "This is where Her Majesty keeps her personal items," Morrison explained, producing another key from his ring. "Jewelry with sentimental value, letters, that sort of thing. Lady Worthington has never been given a key to this particular drawer." The lock clicked open and Morrison pulled the drawer out carefully. Inside, Edward could see several small velvet boxes, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and a photograph album. Morrison lifted out the boxes one by one, opening each to inspect the contents. The first box contained a pair of pearl earrings. The second held a diamond bracelet that sparkled even in the muted afternoon light. The third box made Morrison pause. He stared into it for a long moment before looking up at Edward with a grave expression. "What is it, sir?" Edward asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The gold locket," Morrison said quietly. "It's gone." Edward felt his pulse quicken. He had been right. Something had been taken. But the confirmation brought him no satisfaction, only a deep sense of dread about what would come next. Morrison carefully examined the empty box, then the drawer itself, as if hoping the locket might have simply fallen out of place, but there was nowhere else it could be. The small indentation in the velvet where the locket had rested was clearly visible, a ghost of what had been there. "Tell me about this locket," Edward said. "Is it valuable?" Morrison closed the drawer and locked it again, his movements deliberate and careful. "In monetary terms? Perhaps a few £1,000s. It's gold with a small ruby, nothing extraordinary." But in terms of sentiment? Priceless. It belonged to the Queen's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations. Her Majesty wears it on special family occasions. She treasures it above most of her other pieces. The weight of this information settled over Edward like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just a theft. This was a betrayal of trust, a violation of something deeply personal to the Queen. And if Lady Camilla Worthington had indeed taken it, the scandal would be enormous. "What do we do now?" Edward asked. Morrison walked to the window and looked out, his hands clasped behind his back. "We need to be absolutely certain before we make any accusations. Lady Worthington has been a trusted member of the Queen's household for years. If we're wrong, the consequences would be severe. But if we're right and we don't act, we fail in our duty." "I know what I saw," Edward insisted. The gold chain around her neck hidden under her dress. The way she was acting. It all fits. "I believe you," Morrison said, turning to face him. "But belief isn't proof. We need to catch her with the locket in her possession, or we need her to confess. Anything less and she can claim innocence. Her word against yours, and she has far more influence in this palace than either of us." Edward understood the dilemma. The palace operated on strict hierarchies and protocols. A guard accusing a lady of the court would need ironclad evidence to be taken seriously by those in power. Even with Morrison's support, they were walking a dangerous line. "Could we search her quarters?" Edward suggested. Morrison shook his head. "Not without approval from higher authority. And that would require us to explain our suspicions. If word got back to Lady Worthington before we found the locket, she would simply hide it elsewhere or dispose of it entirely. No, we need a different approach." The 2 men stood in silence for a moment, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound in the room. Edward's mind raced through possibilities, each more complicated than the last. They needed to act quickly but carefully, a difficult balance to strike. "What if we watch her?" Edward proposed. "Follow her movements. See if she tries to leave the palace with the locket or hide it somewhere. Eventually she'll make a mistake." Morrison considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "That could work, but it needs to be discreet. If she realizes she's being watched, she'll become cautious. We need her to feel safe, secure in thinking she's gotten away with it." "I can do it," Edward volunteered. "My shift ends in an hour, but I can stay late." "Follow her without being obvious about it." "No," Morrison said firmly. "You've already interacted with her today. If she sees you again, especially out of uniform or in areas where you wouldn't normally be, she might become suspicious. I'll assign someone else, someone she won't recognize as easily. Jenkins, perhaps. He has a gift for blending in." Edward wanted to protest. He had been the one to spot the theft. He wanted to be part of bringing the thief to justice. But he also understood Morrison's reasoning. Personal feelings had no place in a security operation. "There's something else we need to consider," Morrison continued. "Why would Lady Worthington steal from the Queen? She comes from a wealthy family. She has access to her own jewelry, her own resources. What would drive her to risk everything for a single locket, no matter how beautiful?" This question had been nagging at Edward as well. Camilla Worthington didn't seem like someone who needed money. Her clothes were always expensive, her jewelry impressive. She lived comfortably and moved in the highest social circles. What could possibly motivate such a betrayal? "Maybe it's not about the money," Edward suggested. "Maybe she wanted it for some other reason. Sentiment, spite, perhaps there's something about the locket itself that we don't know." Morrison nodded slowly. "That's a good point. I'll need to research the locket's history more thoroughly. There might be something that makes it particularly desirable beyond its monetary or sentimental value. In the meantime, we watch and wait." The captain made some notes in a small leather journal he kept in his jacket pocket, then looked at Edward with an expression that mixed approval and concern. "You did well to bring this to me, Harrison. Not every guard would have noticed what you did, and fewer still would have had the courage to report it. Your father would be proud." Edward felt a flush of pride at the compliment, though it was quickly overshadowed by the gravity of the situation. They locked the study door and made their way back through the palace corridors, both men lost in their own thoughts about what would come next. As Edward finally headed home that evening, still in his uniform, he couldn't shake the image of Camilla's flushed face and nervous movements. Somewhere in this palace, or perhaps in her home in the city, that stolen locket was hidden, and somehow they needed to find it and expose the truth before the Queen returned from France. The evening air was cool as he walked to his car. Above the palace, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Edward thought about his daughter's birthday party, about the normal life he led outside these palace walls. But tonight, that normal life felt very far away. He was caught up in something bigger now, something that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. He just hoped they could resolve it before things got even more complicated. Jenkins was a different sort of guard than Edward. Where Edward was tall and obvious, Jenkins was average in every way, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd without effort. He had worked palace security for 8 years, mostly in plainclothes assignments that required discretion rather than intimidation. When Captain Morrison briefed him on the situation, Jenkins simply nodded and accepted the assignment without questions. The next morning, Jenkins positioned himself in the palace gardens with a newspaper and a cup of coffee, dressed in the casual clothes of a maintenance worker. From his bench near the south entrance, he had a clear view of the parking area, where staff members came and went. He had been given a photograph of Lady Camilla Worthington and instructions to follow her movements throughout the day without being detected. Edward, meanwhile, had returned to his regular post outside the Queen's quarters. The morning felt endless. Every minute seemed to stretch into an hour as he wondered what Jenkins might be discovering. Had Camilla brought the locket with her today? Was she planning to remove it from the palace? Or had she already hidden it somewhere safe, perhaps in her London townhouse? Around 11 o'clock, Edward's radio crackled softly. It was Jenkins, his voice barely above a whisper. Subject is on the move. Heading toward the East Wing Library. I'm following at a distance. Edward wanted desperately to abandon his post and join the surveillance, but he knew that would be foolish. He had his duties, and Morrison had been clear about maintaining normal operations. Any deviation from routine might alert Camilla that something was wrong. The day crawled forward. Edward heard periodic updates from Jenkins through his earpiece. Camilla had spent 2 hours in the library, apparently working on catalog of some sort. She had lunch in the staff dining room with 2 other members of the cultural committee. She made several phone calls from an office in the administrative wing. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. By 4 o'clock, Edward was beginning to doubt himself. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps that glint of gold had been her own necklace and her nervous behavior had simply been stress from work. Perhaps he had accused an innocent woman and set in motion events that would embarrass everyone involved. Then Jenkins' voice came through the radio again, more urgent this time. She's leaving the palace. Getting into her car. Should I follow? Edward heard Morrison's voice respond. Yes, maintain distance. Don't let her spot you. The next hour was agonizing. Edward's shift ended, but he stayed at the palace waiting in Morrison's office for news. The captain paced back and forth, his usual calm demeanor showing cracks of tension. They both knew that if Camilla was leaving the palace with the locket, this might be their only chance to catch her with it. Finally, Jenkins called in. She stopped at a jewelry shop on Bond Street. Going inside now. I'm parking nearby. Morrison grabbed his coat. Let's go. Harrison, you're with me. They drove through London traffic in Morrison's unmarked sedan, weaving between buses and taxis with an urgency that made Edward grip the door handle. Bond Street was one of the most exclusive shopping districts in the city, home to luxury brands and high-end jewelers. What was Camilla doing there? They arrived to find Jenkins standing outside a coffee shop across the street from an elegant jewelry store called Rothman & Associates. Through the shop's large windows, they could see Camilla speaking with a well-dressed man behind the counter. She's been in there for about 10 minutes, Jenkins reported. Seems to be having an intense conversation with the owner. Morrison studied the shop carefully. Rothman & Associates. I know this place. They're reputable, been in business for over 100 years. They do appraisals, repairs, and they're very discreet about buying estate jewelry from aristocratic families who need money quietly. You think she's trying to sell the locket? Edward asked. Possibly. Or she might be getting it appraised to see what it's worth. Either way, if she has it with her, this is our chance. They watched through the window as Camilla reached into her handbag and pulled out something small. From their distance, they couldn't see exactly what it was, but she placed it on the counter between herself and the jeweler. The man picked it up, examining it closely with a loupe pressed to his eye. Morrison made a decision. We're going in. Harrison, you stay here with Jenkins. If she tries to run, you stop her. I'm going to have a word with Mr. Rothman. The captain crossed the street and entered the jewelry shop. Through the window, Edward watched as Morrison approached the counter and showed his identification to the jeweler. Camilla's body language changed instantly. Her shoulders tensed and her hand moved toward the object on the counter, but Morrison was faster. He picked it up and examined it closely. Even from across the street, Edward could see the color drain from Camilla's face. She was saying something, her hands gesturing emphatically. But Morrison's expression remained stern and unmoved. The jeweler looked uncomfortable, clearly caught in the middle of something he wanted no part of. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, Morrison and Camilla emerged from the shop. Morrison was holding a small evidence bag, and inside it Edward could see the unmistakable glint of gold. Camilla walked beside him, her head down, her earlier elegance replaced by a defeated slouch. Morrison guided her to the sedan and helped her into the back seat. He handed the evidence bag to Edward. "Guard this with your life. We're taking Lady Worthington back to the palace for questioning." Edward looked down at the bag in his hands. Inside was a beautiful gold locket on a delicate chain, with a small ruby set into its face. It was exactly as Morrison had described, elegant but not ostentatious. The kind of piece that spoke more of memories than money. The drive back to the palace was silent except for the sound of traffic outside. Camilla sat in the back seat staring out the window with tears streaming down her face. She didn't try to defend herself or offer explanations. She simply wept quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Edward felt a strange mixture of emotions. He had been right, which brought a sense of validation, but there was no satisfaction in seeing this woman, who had always been kind to the guards, reduced to such a state. He found himself wondering again what could have driven her to such a desperate act. When they arrived back at the palace, Morrison escorted Camilla to a private conference room, while Edward delivered the locket to the secure evidence locker. As he placed it carefully inside and locked the door, he couldn't help but wonder about all the history this small piece of jewelry had seen. The Queen's grandmother had worn it. The Queen herself had cherished it for decades, and now it sat in an evidence locker, at the center of what would surely become a major scandal. Captain Morrison appeared in the doorway of the evidence room. "Good work, Harrison. The locket is confirmed as the Queen's property. Lady Worthington has admitted to taking it." "Did she say why?" Edward asked. Morrison's expression was troubled. "She's asking to speak with the Queen directly before she explains her reasons. She refuses to tell anyone else. We've contacted Her Majesty's office in France. She's cutting her visit short and will return tomorrow morning." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. The Queen would be furious. A member of her trusted inner circle had betrayed her, stolen something precious. The consequences would be severe. Possibly criminal charges, definitely social ruin for Camilla and her family. "What happens now?" Edward asked. "Now we wait," Morrison replied. "Lady Worthington will remain in palace custody overnight. Tomorrow when the Queen returns, we'll get to the bottom of this. Whatever her reasons for taking the locket, they'd better be extraordinary, because right now she's facing theft charges that could send her to prison." As Edward finally left the palace that evening, hours later than he had planned, his mind was spinning with questions. Why had Camilla taken the locket? What could she possibly say to the Queen that would explain such a betrayal? And what would happen when the truth finally came out? He drove home through the London streets, the city lights blurring past his windows. His daughter's birthday party would have to wait. Right now he was part of something much bigger, a scandal that would shake the palace to its foundations. And tomorrow, when the Queen returned, everything would come to light. The Queen's private plane touched down at RAF Northolt just after 7 in the morning. Her return had been arranged with unusual haste, and the minimal staff present at the airfield understood that something serious had occurred. Edward had been called in early to serve as part of the security detail that would escort Her Majesty directly to the palace. He stood at attention as the Queen descended from the aircraft, her expression unreadable behind large sunglasses. She was a woman who had mastered the art of composing herself in public, never letting her true emotions show. But Edward, who had observed her for years, noticed the tight set of her jaw and the stiffness in her movements. She was angry, deeply angry, and working hard to contain it. The motorcade traveled through the quiet London streets in the early morning light. Edward sat in the security vehicle watching the city pass by. Somewhere in the palace, Camilla Worthington was waiting, knowing that her fate would soon be decided. He wondered if she had slept at all during her night in custody. Upon arriving at the palace, the Queen went directly to her private apartments without speaking to anyone. Captain Morrison received word to bring Lady Worthington to the Queen's study in 1 hour. The message was clear. Her Majesty wanted time to compose herself before facing the woman who had betrayed her trust. Edward was assigned to stand guard outside the study during the meeting. As the hour approached, he took his position, standing at attention beside the heavy oak door. His heart was pounding harder than usual. Whatever happened in that room would determine not just Camilla's fate, but might also reveal the mystery behind the theft. Captain Morrison arrived first, escorting Lady Camilla down the corridor. She looked terrible. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled from being worn all night, and her usually perfect hair hung limply around her face. She walked slowly like someone approaching an execution, which in a social sense she probably was. Morrison knocked on the study door, and the Queen's voice called out, "Enter." They went inside and the door closed behind them. Edward remained outside, trying not to listen, but unable to avoid hearing raised voices through the thick wood. The Queen's tone was sharp, controlled but furious. Camilla's voice was softer, harder to make out, punctuated by what sounded like sobs. Edward checked his watch. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. The voices inside rose and fell like waves, sometimes nearly shouting, sometimes dropping to whispers he couldn't hear at all. At one point, there was a long silence that stretched for several minutes, so quiet that Edward wondered if someone had fainted or left through another exit. Then Camilla's voice rose clearly, loud enough to hear through the door. "I did it because she's dying." The words hung in the air. Edward felt his blood run cold. Who was dying? What did that have to do with stealing the Queen's locket? More muffled conversation followed, too quiet to distinguish, but the tone had changed. The anger seemed to have drained away, replaced by something else. Sadness, perhaps, or shock. After nearly 40 minutes, the study door finally opened. Captain Morrison emerged first, his face grave. Behind him came Lady Camilla, still crying but with a different quality to her tears now. Not the desperate sobs of fear, but something deeper, more genuine. And behind her, to Edward's surprise, came the Queen herself. Her Majesty's face was softer than Edward had ever seen it. There were tears in her eyes, something he had never witnessed in all his years of service. She placed a hand on Camilla's shoulder, a gesture of comfort rather than accusation. "Captain Morrison," the Queen said, her voice thick with emotion, "please ensure that Lady Worthington has a car to take her home. She needs to be with her family right now." "Of course, Your Majesty," Morrison replied, though his confusion was evident. The Queen looked at Edward, seeming to notice him for the first time. "Mr. Harrison, isn't it? You're the one who discovered the theft?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Edward replied, his throat suddenly dry. "You did your duty admirably," she said. "But I want you to understand that this matter is now resolved. Lady Worthington will face no charges. What happened was a misunderstanding, born from desperate circumstances. Do you understand?" Edward nodded, though he understood nothing at all. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good, this incident is to remain confidential. The locket has been returned, and that is all anyone needs to know. I trust I can count on your discretion?" "Absolutely, Your Majesty," Edward assured her. The Queen turned back to Camilla and embraced her, a shocking breach of protocol that told Edward more than words ever could about what had transpired in that study. Something fundamental had changed. Whatever Camilla had revealed had transformed the situation entirely. After Camilla was escorted out by another guard, Morrison and Edward stood alone in the corridor, both men processing what they had just witnessed. "What in heaven's name just happened?" Edward asked quietly. Morrison shook his head slowly. "I honestly don't know, but we follow orders. The Queen says this is resolved, so it's resolved. Come on, we need to debrief." In Morrison's office, they sat across from each other, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Morrison poured 2 cups of strong tea, something he rarely did, which told Edward how rattled the captain was. "In all my years," Morrison said slowly, "I've never seen anything quite like that." The Queen was prepared to press charges, possibly send Lady Worthington to prison. And then, in less than an hour, everything changed. "She said someone was dying," Edward ventured. "I heard that much through the door." Morrison set down his teacup carefully. "That's not for us to speculate about. But whatever the explanation, it was enough to satisfy Her Majesty completely. Not just satisfy, but move her to compassion. Edward thought about the embrace he had witnessed, the tears in the Queen's eyes. Do you think Lady Worthington was planning to sell the locket to pay for medical treatment? For whoever is dying? Perhaps, Morrison said. That would certainly explain the desperation. But again, we're speculating. And we've been ordered not to. They sat in silence for a moment, both men grappling with the strangeness of the situation. Edward had expected justice, punishment, consequences. Instead, he had witnessed mercy and forgiveness on a scale he hadn't anticipated. What about the locket? Edward asked. Is it back in the Queen's possession? Morrison nodded. I returned it to the drawer myself in Her Majesty's presence. Everything is as it was, physically at least, though I suspect the emotional landscape has changed considerably. Edward finished his tea and stood to leave. His shift was technically over, and he was exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the past 2 days. But before he left, he had one more question. Sir, do you think we did the right thing, investigating, following Lady Worthington, confronting her? Morrison looked at him seriously. We did our duty, Harrison. We saw what appeared to be a theft, and we acted appropriately. The fact that the situation turned out to be more complicated than it seemed doesn't change that. Sometimes doing the right thing means uncovering truths that are difficult for everyone involved. Edward nodded, accepting this wisdom. As he left the palace that morning, the London streets were now busy with the usual morning traffic. People hurried to work, bought coffee, lived their ordinary lives. None of them knew about the drama that had unfolded behind the palace walls. The theft and the forgiveness, the anger and the tears. He thought about Camilla Worthington, who had risked everything for reasons he would probably never fully understand. He thought about the Queen, who had shown a side of herself that few people ever witnessed, the human being behind the crown. And he thought about that little gold locket, which had caused so much trouble and revealed so much about the people involved. As Edward drove home, he realized that this case had taught him something important. Things were rarely as simple as they first appeared. People acted for complex reasons, driven by circumstances he couldn't see or understand. His job was to observe and protect, but judgment belonged to others. His daughter's birthday party was tomorrow, and he was determined to be fully present for it. This strange chapter was closed, resolved in a way he never could have predicted. The locket was back where it belonged, and whatever secrets had been shared in the Queen's study would remain there, protected by royal decree and his own sense of duty. 3 days had passed since the incident, and life at the palace had returned to its usual rhythm. Edward stood at his regular post, watching staff members move through the corridors with their customary efficiency. On the surface, everything appeared normal. But beneath that surface, he knew that something significant had changed, even if he didn't fully understand what. Lady Camilla Worthington had not returned to the palace. Word had spread quietly among the staff that she was taking a leave of absence for personal reasons. No one questioned it, at least not openly. In the peculiar ecosystem of palace life, people had learned not to pry too deeply into matters that didn't concern them directly. Edward had kept his promise to the Queen. He hadn't spoken about the incident to anyone except Captain Morrison, and even with the captain, their conversations were carefully vague. His wife had asked why he seemed distracted, and he had blamed it on work stress without elaborating. Some secrets were too important to share, even with those closest to him. On Thursday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Edward received a message through the internal palace communication system. The Queen requested his presence in her study at 3 o'clock. His immediate supervisor confirmed the message was genuine, though he looked as puzzled as Edward felt. In 12 years of service, Edward had never been summoned for a private audience with Her Majesty. He spent the next hour in a state of nervous anticipation. Had he done something wrong? Was there a problem with how he had handled the investigation? Or perhaps the Queen simply wanted to thank him personally for his diligence. He changed into his most pristine uniform, polished his shoes until they gleamed, and made sure every detail of his appearance was perfect. At precisely 3 o'clock, Edward knocked on the study door. The Queen's voice called for him to enter. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and stood at attention. The Queen was seated at her desk, looking more relaxed than he had seen her in days. She gestured to a chair opposite her. Please sit down, Mr. Harrison. This is not a formal audience. Edward sat carefully on the edge of the chair, his back straight, his hands folded in his lap. The Queen studied him for a moment with those sharp, intelligent eyes that had assessed countless diplomats and world leaders over the years. I wanted to speak with you personally, she began, because you were instrumental in uncovering a situation that, while distressing, ultimately needed to be brought to light. You did your duty with discretion and professionalism. Thank you, Your Majesty, Edward replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. The Queen picked up a letter opener from her desk, turning it over in her hands as she gathered her thoughts. I also wanted you to understand as much as is appropriate what actually transpired. Not the details, which must remain private, but enough that you don't spend the rest of your career wondering if justice was truly served. Edward waited, hardly daring to breathe. Lady Worthington's mother is dying, the Queen said simply. Cancer quite advanced. The family has been struggling financially for some time, something they hid very well from society. The medical treatments are expensive, experimental procedures not covered by insurance. Camilla was desperate. The pieces began to fall into place in Edward's mind. The nervousness, the flush in her cheeks, the visit to the jeweler on Bond Street. She had been trying to sell the locket to pay for her mother's treatment. She didn't steal the locket to keep it or out of malice, the Queen continued. She borrowed it, intending to have a replica made and return the original before I noticed. She knew a jeweler who could create an exact copy, good enough to pass casual inspection. She planned to sell the real one privately and use the money for her mother's care. That's why she took it to Rothman and Associates, Edward said, understanding now, to have them appraise it and possibly create the replica. The Queen nodded. Precisely. It was foolish and illegal, but born from love and desperation rather than greed. When I understood the full situation, I couldn't in good conscience punish her for trying to save her mother's life. Edward felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The mystery that had haunted him for days now made sense. What will happen to her mother, Your Majesty, if I may ask? A small smile crossed the Queen's face. I have made arrangements. The medical bills will be covered, and Lady Worthington's mother will receive the best care available. Camilla doesn't know yet. I wanted to arrange it as a surprise, something positive to come from this difficult situation. The generosity of the gesture moved Edward deeply. This was the Queen that the public rarely saw, the woman behind the crown who cared deeply about the people in her life. As for Camilla, the Queen continued, she will return to her duties here once her mother is stable. She made a terrible mistake, but she has shown genuine remorse and her motivations were pure if misguided. She has my forgiveness. That's very gracious of you, Your Majesty, Edward said. The Queen set down the letter opener and looked at him directly. Mr. Harrison, in your years of service, you've proven yourself to be observant, dedicated, and discreet. These are qualities I value highly. Captain Morrison speaks very well of you, as did your father before your retirement. Edward felt a surge of pride at the mention of his father. I'm promoting you, the Queen announced. You'll be moving to a new position within the palace security team, one that requires both investigative skills and absolute discretion. Captain Morrison will provide the details, but I wanted to tell you myself. Your attentiveness prevented what could have become a much larger problem, and that deserves recognition. Edward was stunned. A promotion was the last thing he had expected from this meeting. Your Majesty, I'm honored. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, the Queen said with a slight smile. The new position comes with considerably more responsibility and stress, but I believe you're ready for it. She stood, indicating the meeting was concluding. Edward rose as well, bowing respectfully. One more thing, the Queen added as he turned to leave. What you witnessed here, the forgiveness and the circumstances behind it, I hope it reminds you that every person has a story. Every action has a context. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about understanding and mercy. I'll remember that, Your Majesty, Edward promised. As he left the study, Edward's mind was reeling. A promotion, a deeper understanding of the case, and a lesson in compassion from the Queen herself. This whole experience had transformed from a simple theft investigation into something far more meaningful. He walked through the palace corridors with a new perspective. The staff members he passed, the aristocrats visiting for meetings, even the tourists glimpsing the palace from outside its gates, they all had their own stories, their own struggles. their own reasons for the things they did. Captain Morrison was waiting for him in his office, a knowing smile on his weathered face. "So she told you about the promotion?" "She did," Edward confirmed. "I'm still processing it." Morrison gestured for him to sit. "You earned it, Harrison. Not just through this incident, but through years of dedicated service. Your father would be proud, and so am I." They spent the next hour discussing the details of Edward's new role. He would be part of a small team that handled sensitive investigations within the palace, matters that required discretion and good judgment. It was exactly the kind of work he had always hoped to do. As Edward finally left the palace that evening, the sun was setting over London, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He thought about Camilla Worthington, who was probably at her mother's bedside right now, unaware that the Queen had arranged for all her medical expenses to be covered. He thought about the gold locket safely back in its drawer, its secret adventure known to only a handful of people. Most of all, he thought about the unexpected turn his life had taken. What had started as a routine morning shift had become a case that challenged his assumptions, tested his judgment, and ultimately led to a new chapter in his career. He drove home with a sense of satisfaction and purpose. Tomorrow he would tell his wife about the promotion. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for his new responsibilities. But tonight he would simply be grateful for the strange path that life had taken, and for the lesson the Queen had taught him about mercy, understanding, and the complex motivations that drive people to make difficult choices. 2 weeks had transformed Edward's daily routine completely. His new position came with a small office near Captain Morrison's, a desk cluttered with files that required his attention, and a level of autonomy he had never experienced before. Instead of standing at attention for hours, he now spent his days reviewing security protocols, investigating minor incidents, and occasionally interviewing staff members about various concerns. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. Edward discovered he had a natural talent for reading people, for noticing inconsistencies in their stories, and for approaching problems with both logic and empathy. Morrison had been right to recommend him for the position. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Edward was reviewing camera footage from the previous night when Morrison knocked on his door frame. "Got a minute?" the captain asked. "Of course, sir." Morrison entered and closed the door behind him, which immediately told Edward this was something significant. "Lady Worthington is returning to the palace today. The Queen thought you should know." Edward set down his pen. He had wondered when Camilla would come back, whether she would be able to face the people who knew what she had done. "How is her mother?" Edward asked. Morrison's expression softened. "Responding well to treatment, apparently. The doctors are optimistic. The Queen's arrangements made all the difference." "That's good to hear." Morrison sat down in the chair across from Edward's desk. "Her Majesty wants you to keep an eye on Lady Worthington for the first few weeks. Not surveillance exactly, just making sure she's settling back in comfortably. Some of the staff may have heard rumors, and the Queen wants to ensure she's not subjected to gossip or harassment." Edward understood. Even though most people didn't know the specifics of what had happened, palace staff had an uncanny ability to sense when something was amiss. Camilla's sudden absence had certainly been noticed, and her return would spark curiosity. "I'll make sure she's treated with respect," Edward promised. "I knew you would," Morrison said, standing to leave. "Oh, and Harrison? The Queen specifically mentioned that you should introduce yourself to Lady Worthington in your new capacity. She thinks it might ease any awkwardness between you two." After Morrison left, Edward sat for a moment, considering how to approach the situation. He had been the one to catch Camilla, to set in motion the events that had exposed her desperate act. Would she resent him for that? Or would she understand he had simply been doing his job? Around 11 o'clock, Edward received word that Lady Worthington had arrived. He made his way to the administrative wing, where he found her in her old office, unpacking boxes of books and personal items. She looked healthier than the last time he had seen her, though there was a wariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. He knocked softly on the open door. "Lady Worthington? May I have a moment?" She looked up and their eyes met. For a brief second, Edward saw fear flash across her face, but it quickly transformed into something else. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly. "Please come in." Edward stepped into the office, closing the door for privacy. They stood facing each other, Two people bound by a shared secret, neither quite sure how to proceed. I wanted to introduce myself properly, Edward began. I've been promoted to a new position in palace security. I'll be working more closely with staff members on various matters. Camilla nodded slowly. Congratulations on your promotion. I heard about it from Her Majesty. She speaks very highly of you. An awkward silence settled between them. Edward could see Camilla struggling with what to say, her hands nervously arranging and rearranging the books on her desk. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Harrison, I owe you an apology, and probably an explanation, though I suspect you already know most of it. You don't owe me anything, Edward said gently. You were caught in an impossible situation. I was just doing my job. Tears welled up in Camilla's eyes, though she blinked them back. Your job probably felt like persecution from my perspective at the time. But looking back, I'm grateful. If you hadn't caught me, I would have gone through with it, sold the locket, and lived with that guilt forever. What you did, uncomfortable as it was, forced everything into the open, and because of that, my mother is getting the care she needs. Edward hadn't expected this. He had anticipated resentment, not gratitude. The Queen's generosity saved your mother, Edward pointed out. Not me. But your diligence brought the truth to light, Camilla countered. Sometimes the hardest act of kindness is refusing to look the other way. You could have ignored what you saw. Many people would have. But you didn't, and ultimately that helped more than it hurt. Edward considered her words carefully. He had spent so many hours wondering if he had done the right thing, if his actions had caused more harm than good. Hearing Camilla's perspective brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he needed. How is your mother doing?
He asked. Camilla's face brightened immediately.
She's doing remarkably well. The treatment is working. The doctors are talking about remission, which seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. It's like a miracle. I'm very glad to hear that. Camilla moved around her desk and extended her hand. Can we start over? As colleagues who had a difficult first encounter but hopefully can move forward professionally, Edward shook her hand firmly. I'd like that. Good, Camilla said with a genuine smile. Because I have a feeling we'll be working together quite a bit. Her Majesty mentioned you might be involved in reviewing the palace's art collection security. And that's very much my area. They spent the next 20 minutes discussing various security concerns related to the palace's valuable artworks and historical artifacts. Edward was impressed by Camilla's knowledge and her practical suggestions for improving protection, without making the palace feel like a fortress. The conversation flowed naturally, and the awkwardness between them gradually dissolved. As Edward left her office, he felt a sense of closure. The case that had consumed his thoughts for weeks had reached not just a resolution, but something better, a transformation. What could have ended in bitterness and recrimination had instead become an opportunity for growth and understanding. Walking back to his office, Edward passed the Queen's study. The door was closed, but he knew that behind it, in a small locked drawer, the gold locket rested safely. That little piece of jewelry had been at the center of such drama, revealing the best and worst of human nature in equal measure. He thought about his father, who had served the palace for so many years. His father had always said that the real job of palace security wasn't just protecting buildings and jewels. It was protecting people, their dignity, their privacy, their ability to make mistakes and find redemption. Edward understood that now in a way he never had before. That evening, as Edward prepared to leave for the day, Captain Morrison stopped him in the corridor. I saw you speaking with Lady Worthington earlier. How did it go? Better than expected, Edward replied honestly. She's a gracious person, stronger than I gave her credit for. Morrison nodded approvingly. Good judgment, Harrison. That's what this job requires more than anything else. The ability to see people clearly, without letting your assumptions cloud your vision. As Edward drove home through the London traffic, rain still pattering against his windshield, he reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. A simple observation, a glint of gold that shouldn't have been there, had set everything in motion. But the real lesson wasn't about catching a thief. It was about understanding that people were complex, that circumstances mattered, and that justice sometimes wore a different face than expected. His daughter would be asleep by the time he got home, but tomorrow was Saturday, and he had promised to take her to the park. Normal life, simple pleasures, the things that really mattered. The palace, with all its drama and secrets, would still be there on Monday. But this weekend belonged to his family, to the ordinary joys that made all the extraordinary challenges worthwhile. 6 months had passed since the incident with the locket, and the palace had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Edward had fully grown into his new role, handling investigations and security matters with the confidence that came from experience and trust. His relationship with Lady Camilla Worthington had evolved into a professional friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what they had both been through. On a bright spring morning, Edward was reviewing security plans for an upcoming state dinner when he received an unexpected summons. The Queen requested his presence in the drawing room, along with Captain Morrison and Lady Worthington. The informal location and the combination of attendees told him this wasn't about official business. When Edward arrived, he found Morrison already there, looking equally curious. Camilla entered moments later, her face showing pleasant confusion. The Queen arrived last, carrying a small velvet box that Edward recognized immediately. It was the box that had once held the gold locket. "Please, everyone sit," the Queen said warmly, gesturing to the elegant sofas arranged near the fireplace. "This won't take long, but I wanted to share something with all of you." They sat, and the Queen remained standing, the box held carefully in her hands. 6 months ago, we all went through something quite difficult. A situation that tested trust, revealed vulnerabilities, and ultimately taught us important lessons about compassion and forgiveness. She looked at each of them in turn. "Mr. Harrison, you did your duty with integrity even when it was uncomfortable. Captain Morrison, you guided this situation with wisdom and discretion. And Camilla, you made a mistake born from love, and you've shown remarkable grace in accepting the consequences and moving forward." Camilla's eyes were already glistening with tears. The Queen opened the velvet box, revealing the gold locket with its small ruby gleaming in the morning light. "This locket has been in my family for 3 generations," the Queen continued. "My grandmother wore it, my mother wore it, and I have worn it on occasions that mattered most to me. It represents family, continuity, and the bonds that tie us together across time." She closed the box and looked directly at Camilla. "Your mother is now in full remission, I understand?" Camilla nodded, unable to speak through her emotion. "I'm so very glad," the Queen said genuinely. "These past months, watching you return to your duties with such dedication, seeing the relief and joy that your mother's recovery has brought you, it has reminded me what truly matters in life. Not objects, no matter how precious, but people, and the love we share with them." The Queen extended the box toward Camilla. "I would like you to have this locket, not as a replacement for what was taken, but as a gift between friends who have been through something profound together." Camilla's eyes widened in shock. "Your Majesty, I couldn't possibly. After what I did, after you tried to save your mother's life using the only resource you thought you had?" The Queen finished gently. "Camilla, you have more than earned my forgiveness. This gift is not about what happened. It's about what I hope will continue. A friendship built on honesty and understanding." Tears streamed down Camilla's face as she accepted the box with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say. This is far more than I deserve." "Nonsense," the Queen said firmly but kindly. "You deserve to move forward without guilt weighing you down. Consider this locket a symbol of new beginnings. Perhaps one day you'll pass it on to someone you love, and it will begin a new legacy of its own." Edward felt his own throat tighten with emotion. This was unprecedented, a gesture of extraordinary generosity that transformed the entire narrative of what had happened. The Queen turned to Edward and Morrison. "And for you too, gentlemen, I want to express my deepest gratitude. You handled an impossible situation with professionalism and discretion. You reminded me that having good people in positions of responsibility makes all the difference." Morrison stood and bowed respectfully. "It has been our honor to serve, Your Majesty." Edward stood as well, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a locket or a theft or an investigation. It was about how people choose to treat each other, especially when circumstances are difficult and emotions are high. The Queen smiled at all of them. "Now, I have a meeting with the Prime Minister in 20 minutes, and I suspect you all have work to do as well. But I wanted us to mark this moment together, to acknowledge that we've all grown from what happened, and to move forward with gratitude rather than regret." As they left the drawing room together, Camilla pulled Edward aside in the corridor. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her smile was radiant. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Edward asked. "For seeing me that day. For not looking away. I know it sounds strange, but if you hadn't caught me, if this had all been swept under the rug somehow, I would have carried that guilt forever. Your integrity forced everything into the light, and light, as painful as it can be sometimes, is where healing happens." Edward thought about this for a moment. "I think we all did what we needed to do. You were trying to save someone you love. I was trying to protect something I was sworn to guard. The Queen showed us all what real wisdom looks like. We each played our part." Camilla opened the velvet box and looked at the locket once more. "My mother would love to hear this story someday. Not now, not yet, but someday when enough time has passed. I'll tell her about the Queen's kindness, about your diligence, about how something that seemed so terrible became something beautiful." They parted ways, Camilla heading to her office and Edward returning to his. As he sat at his desk, Edward pulled out a small notebook where he kept personal reflections separate from official reports. He began to write about what had transpired, not the facts and timelines, but the deeper truths he had learned. He wrote about how easy it would have been to ignore that flash of gold, to convince himself he had imagined it or misinterpreted what he saw. He wrote about the fear he had felt when confronting someone of higher social standing, and the courage it had taken to trust his instincts. He wrote about mercy, about how the Queen had shown him that justice and compassion were not opposites but partners in creating a better world. Most importantly, he wrote about the locket itself, how a small piece of jewelry had become a teacher for everyone involved. It had revealed weakness and strength, desperation and generosity, fear and forgiveness. Now, instead of gathering dust in a drawer, it would live with Camilla, a reminder of the worst day of her life that had somehow transformed into one of the most meaningful. Edward closed the notebook and looked out his window at the palace gardens. Spring flowers were blooming, bringing color back to the landscape after a long winter. It felt appropriate somehow, this sense of renewal and fresh beginnings. His phone buzzed with a message from his wife asking if he would be home for dinner. He smiled and typed back that he would, and that he had a story to tell her, though he would have to be careful about the details. Some things would always remain confidential, protected by his oath and his respect for those involved. As Edward finished his work for the day, he thought about his father and grandfather, both of whom had served the palace before him. He wondered if they had experienced moments like this, when their duty had intersected with human drama in unexpected ways. He suspected they had, and he felt a deep connection to them across time, linked by the shared commitment to serve with integrity. The evening sun cast long shadows across his office as Edward prepared to leave. He locked his files away, straightened his desk, and took one last look at the palace grounds before heading out. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new situations that required his attention and judgment. But he would face them with the confidence that came from having navigated through something difficult and emerged stronger on the other side. The gold locket, once the center of a scandal, was now a symbol of redemption and grace. Somewhere in London, Camilla Worthington was probably showing it to her mother, sharing the story of the Queen's extraordinary kindness. And in a drawing room at the palace, the Queen was likely conducting her meeting with the Prime Minister, carrying the weight of the nation on her shoulders, while never forgetting the individual human stories that made up the larger tapestry of her reign. Edward walked to his car, the spring air fresh and promising. Life at the palace would always involve secrets and surprises, moments of tension and revelation. But he was ready for whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it was hard, always mattered. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it led to outcomes more beautiful than you ever could have imagined.